Welcome to Personality. I'm your host, Lori Rawlings from Lori Rawlings and Associates. And my guest today is Julie Bonasso, and we're going to be talking about how she revolutionizes the way that women work. Julie is a graduate of Temple Law School, and she is currently a consultant and coach specializing in professional well-being and executive health coaching. She's an experienced corporate lawyer and a master certified coach, and she helps clients integrate self with career to accelerate growth. The cornerstone of her coaching is leveraging well-being as a pathway to success. And she is the founder and CEO of Julie Bonasso Coaching. Julie, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Lori. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited that you're here because I'll just be honest. I just fangirled you because I read an article that you read or that you wrote in the Wisconsin Lawyer magazine. And I was like, oh my God, this person gets me. I have to have her on the podcast. So can you start by telling us a little bit about your background and your experiences practicing law?
Sure. Well, that's so exciting. Thank you. Thank you for that. You know, I started off practicing law at a big law firm in Philadelphia, and I went into it with not a lot of intention, Laurie. Like it was just sort of the next step, and I thought it was something that I needed to do because that's what all of my peers were doing. So, long story short, I went into this career and went into this firm without really tuning into what I wanted to do. It was something that I thought I should do. And as a consequence, I ran into a lot of tension and resistance and friction along the way, ending up in burnout after practicing for about 10 years. So that's kind of the short version of my early career in law.
That sounds exactly like my experience.
Yeah.
So why did you then transition from practicing law to becoming a career coach?
So I think, you know, your experience, you said, was similar to mine. And one of the reasons I moved into coaching is because I started meeting other women who were having similar experiences. So for about 10 to 15 years, I felt my health was being impacted. I felt really shitty. Can I say that here? Really shitty about
an X-rated
myself.
podcast. Right. Yes, you can say swear words.
My self-esteem was taking a hit because everything that I had done up until that date is I had followed this blueprint. And if you work hard and you do this, you'll have success. And so I was doing that in the law firm world, but I wasn't having success. My health was being crushed. And then I was also feeling really insecure about my capabilities. And more than all of that, the bigger hit that was happening was like what I say to my psyche. Like I was really being impacted from a soul perspective. So after jumping around a lot, I decided to move into recruiting, and I went to work for this great organization. And a lot of your listeners may have heard of it, Major Lindsay in Africa. They're a global recruiting firm.
Sure.
And it was there that I started to see this little light bulb of when I was helping candidates who were coming to me looking for a new career or new job. I should say a new job, not a new career. That it really lit me up. And many of them, most of them were women, and most of them actually had been on a similar journey that I had. They were just jumping from one job to another without really thinking about the bigger picture of a career. What did they want to really do? So it was in that moment I felt like the seed of coaching was born, because I felt that there was a need that was going untapped, that there were a lot of women who were really suffering, particularly moms, and they didn't feel like they had any options. And I wanted to be able to give them some hope and some options and a path.
That's so brave. I mean, how did you find the courage to make that shift?
It was really scary. And I thank you for saying it was brave. I didn't feel like that at the time. But I think what motivated me to make the shift and to stick with the shift is this deep, deep desire to help institute change for other people, because I really saw a system that was very broken. And I didn't feel that I could change the system, but I felt that I could help those within the system who wanted a change for themselves get that change for themselves. And so when times got rough, or when it felt scary, or I felt really insecure about leaving the great paying job or being judged by other people for doing so, I just kept coming back to that why, that I felt like I had a mission, that I was also uniquely suited, given my experience and who I was as a human, to help people really create a better life for themselves.
That's amazing. And, you know, a lot of the things you're talking about, they sound so familiar to me. Like, I jumped around a lot in my career practicing law too, because, I didn't have a plan. I just kind of jumped from one place to another because I'm like, I don't like it here. Maybe it'll be better over there, but without really putting a lot of thought into it. And I thought I was the only one. But it sounds like a lot of people do that. Why do we do that, Julie?
I know that, feeling like the only one, I felt that so deeply back then. And I felt such shame.
Mm-hmm.
I thought,
me too.
I couldn't cut it. Right. And it's like, what's wrong with me? I really was self-critical, calling myself a loser and just kind of like failure. You can't, I don't have biological kids. And this was during the time that I was, in my early 30s. And so I wasn't able to have kids. I felt like my career was failing and that I was just like missing at every mark. And then I also say this, Lori, with like a reflection and an awareness, like, you know what? I'm also somebody who grew up very privileged as a white, educated woman in a family who loved her. And so I want to be sensitive to that too. Like, that I was suffering and I also had all of this opportunity. And so also kind of managing both of those things, like, what are you going to do with all of this opportunity and how are you going to have an impact, instead of maybe showing up in more of a victim mindset. So you asked the question, why do we do that? Like, I think we do feel so alone and isolated. And that maybe if we raise our hand or express our feelings, especially back then when I was coming up in the late 90s, early 2000s, like nobody was talking about it. It's more acceptable now, and yet it's still scary. And so I'm not sure if I even answered your question, but I think it's more of a common experience. And the more we talk about it and the more we share with people that they're not alone, I think the more brave people can stand up and say, yeah, I've kind of had enough of this and I'm going to go claim my life back.
I think that's absolutely true. It's really important. I didn't even realize that I wasn't alone until I read your article and I stopped practicing law.
Wow.
Yeah, I stopped practicing law like 10 years ago. I jumped to a different career. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Just talking about it is the very first step to getting people to recognize that, oh, okay, like I'm not the only one who feels this way. And maybe it's not me. Like maybe I just don't fit in this system. And maybe there's a way that I can figure out where I do fit, where I do belong.
Hey, Lori, how did you make the change 10 years ago?
It was so serendipitous. So I had jumped around. I worked for 3 different law firms. I did a couple of in-house counsel positions. And I never really liked practicing law. I mean, there were aspects that I liked about it. I loved the intellectual stimulation. I love research and writing. But I was a litigator, and I told my doctor when I was hospitalized for pneumonia during a particularly stressful case that if I had intentionally set out to choose a career that was more wrong for me, that I couldn't have done so, because I don't have the killer instinct, I guess, to be a litigator, like I expected to just like, we're going to follow the rules of civil procedure and you're going to answer my discovery requests and I'll answer yours. And then the case will be decided on the merits. And it turns out that's not how it works. Right. So I was very naive, like I'm the only lawyer in my family. I had no background. I think I told you this the first time we talked. I went to law school because Atticus Finch was my hero. And I probably should have paid a little bit of closer attention to how To Kill a Mockingbird ends, because he loses the case and his client gets murdered trying to escape from prison. So anyway, that's a long way of saying serendipitously at one of my in-house counsel roles, I was working with an engineer whose brother-in-law was the executive director of a contractors association. And that gentleman was also a lawyer by trade. He was getting ready to retire. He needed somebody to assist him with labor negotiations that year. So the engineer I worked with connected us because he knew that I was looking for a different career opportunity. So I went to work as the associate director for a contractors association and absolutely loved it. And I did that for 10 years. First in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then for 3 years in Portland, Oregon. But I also saw some, gaps in the marketplace there and decided to start my own consulting business a couple of years ago, focusing on recruiting and retaining more women and people of color into the construction trades because there's such a desperate need to do that. And I felt like that was the most fun part of my job as an executive director and just something I was very passionate about. So trial and error, serendipity, no
bravery and courage. I mean,
thanks. Or stupidity. It's one or the other. A lack of a sense of self-preservation. So yeah, no great thought out career plan. So, yeah, but I think more people than care to admit it probably kind of fumble around in the same way that you and I did. Have you seen that?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me too, and a lot of my clients who I coach, if they're looking for a career change, it's definitely not a straight line. I always describe it as sort of a stair step. It's, you take a little step forward and then you plateau for a while, take another step forward and plateau for a while. So from me leaving traditional practice of law to getting here today, definitely was not a straight line. And there were some back steps as well where I thought, okay, I got to go back into this. This is, the life I want to create is not working, or at least I didn't believe it could work. And so there was a lot of, in this process of really claiming the life and the career that you want, there's both the inner work, which comes down to what do you believe is possible, and then pairing that with, as some of my mentors like to say, inspired action. So I do see that, and I see that it can be very scary, right? To also leave a very lucrative paying job. The clients I work with, some of them want a new career, and some of them, for whatever reason, can't leave So I really try and help them through both of those paths. And again, recognizing this just not a straight line, that there's going to be some peaks and valleys, but hopefully those peaks and valleys sort of even out over time. But yeah, particularly in the beginning, I wasn't intentional for many, many years. And then once I got clarity, which is really the first step on what I wanted out of life for myself, then I was able to build my career around that. But it wasn't until I really had true clarity.
And how did you find that clarity?
So I've worked with a lot of coaches in this journey, done a lot of like personal growth. But honestly, the clarity for me came down to something that seems very basic, but it's also part of a lot of the work I do, is I was feeling misaligned with my values, although I couldn't articulate what that was. So remember earlier I said like my psyche, my soul was really feeling impacted in the work I was doing as a young associate in a big law firm. And that was because I wasn't living my life aligned with my values. And so for me, how I got that clarity was really thinking about what was important to me. And once I identified the 2 or 3 key values that were important to me, then I started building my career around that. So I really look at this idea of integration more than balance, and more than just career versus life, is them really knitted together. And so that's kind of how I started, and that's how I got clarity on building this business that I have today.
And so is that where the journey begins with your coaching clients? I mean, can you kind of walk us through a little bit what the process is like when you coach someone?
Yeah, I think the first step really is clarity, and there are several different ways to get there. But until we have clarity, it's really hard to build any action steps or set any goals to get to where you're going if you really are just like we were, and like many of my clients are, many lawyers I speak to, just kind of doing the next thing or being passive. And so we're kind of like bouncing around from thing to thing without having a clear vision. So definitely clarity is where we start. How we get to clarity depends on the client, but the values work is more often than not, part of the process. I do some other assessments depending on the client so that they can get a real robust sense of what are my values, what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, what do I really love to do, what do I hate to do, what gives me energy, what's impacting my health, what is giving me more health. I think particularly as lawyers or executives, we're very logic driven, very intellectually driven, and we're only thinking about sort of the bottom line as it comes to our career. So I really I really widen that lens and take a more holistic approach at the get-go with my clients in terms of assessing and developing clarity. Because then once you have clarity, then we can get to like goal setting, action steps,
right,
things that we love to do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been on that journey myself since I started this consulting business, because I had to really sit down and think about, what do I want? I've always done like what my teachers and my parents and my bosses told me that I needed to do and what I should want. But I never really sat down and went through that sort of soul searching process that you're talking about, that I think is critical if you actually want to build a career that gives you work-life balance and fulfillment, which I think are so important. And you mentioned that a lot of your clients are women in leadership roles.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to pick up on that, because in the article that you wrote for the Wisconsin Lawyer magazine recently, you talked about a study by leanin.org and McKinsey and Company, which is called Women in the Workforce, that showed that women leaders who are already underrepresented in the corporate settings are switching jobs even more frequently than in the past, at the highest rate in years. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about why that is and, what's contributing to that and maybe how we can solve that.
I want to come back to something that's part of this. And it was what you said about you hadn't really asked yourself before, what do I really want? And I think that's a lot of women, is that we've been taught, we've been socialized that if we do that, that's selfish. We have been taught to be quiet, to not have a seat at the table, to be in the background, to take a submissive role. And so all of that societal conditioning, I think, has prevented us from having that deep soul searching of saying, no, what do I want? So just wanted to come back to that because I think it's really important. I think it's a foundational piece for this next question. So anybody can go out and read the report, and it's pretty lengthy, and look at the statistics and so forth. But what it said, in short, was not really surprising to me. And that is a lot of the systems in which women have been working in, the traditional corporate systems, have not been built for women, have not been built for a more diverse workplace of opinions, of ethnicity, of gender, of religion. They have been built by and large by white men and have been around for decades, if not centuries. That is changing. But I think because of that, there's this concept called pattern matching. And I forget the exact definition, but the concept is when women are seeking venture capital, right now they're only getting like 2.7% of venture capital. Part of what they are faced with is when they're going to the investors don't recognize these women of color, let's say, because they are white men. So they are pattern matching and giving money to other white men. And I think that same concept is coming up. It's sort of like a part of stereotyping. It comes up within traditional corporate organizations. So women are coming into these organizations and taught to or feel compelled to act like men and let go of the things that make them them. Or if they don't, then they are criticized for acting like men. So then there's this tension.
Right.
And even things that we traditionally think of as like traditional women leadership traits like collaboration and empathy and vulnerability, those generally have not been viewed favorably, even though something like empathy is like one of the most critical leadership skills that one can have. So I think women, to get to your, the answer to your question, I think one of the reasons women are leaving in droves is because we are becoming more self-aware of like, that question of what do I want, and asking that and doing that soul searching, seeing that they're not getting it and saying, okay, I'm going to go start something else on my own, because now more than ever, there's the possibility to do that. Or if I've got to stay, what are some of the things that I can do within the structure to try and put in place? But I think women are leaving now more than ever because they're more self-aware, we have more agency, and there are more opportunities to say we can create our own business and exactly how and run it the way we want to run it.
Yeah, you raised so many great points there.
I tend to speak
So,
a lot. Help me out.
no, me too. I speak in paragraphs. So many things came up for me there. So the double standard, the tension to act like a man, but then be criticized for acting like a man. There's a Supreme Court case exactly on that topic. It's the Price Waterhouse case where the partner, the woman who, I forget the name of the plaintiff. I'll put it in the show notes. But anyway, she outpaced pretty much everyone, had better business results than anyone, but she kept not making partner. And so she talked to her supervisor and he said, well, you need to wear makeup and jewelry and like dress more like a woman. And the Supreme Court was like, what? That's sex discrimination. Like gender stereotyping that's against the law. Are you serious? I mean, they wrote it in a more erudite way than I expressed it. But that was essentially their point. And that was in the late 80s, but it's still happening.
Yes.
And it's, and that pressure, the double standard, there's a great book called Machiavelli for Women, which is by an NPR reporter whose name I also can't remember. I'm terrible with names. I'll put that in the show notes too. But she refers to that phenomenon as the hot box, where you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, right? If you are assertive, you get labeled aggressive or worse, a bitch. But if you are passive, then you get labeled as weak. Whereas men who are assertive, that's seen as a good thing. But conversely, men who are more passive are also praised in a positive way. They're seen as more thoughtful and careful. And so, yeah, I've experienced that. And feeling the pressure to act and look like a man. I mean, look at the way I'm dressed, right? Like this is how I dressed every day that I was practicing law. Yeah. And I was the executive director of contractors associations. I wore suits every day so people would take me more seriously. But at some point, I just started wearing pretty dresses all the time. And a lot of the female construction workers would come up to me and say, I love that you wear dresses. So I don't know. There's just a whole morass of like confusing messages that you get about how you're supposed to dress and how you're supposed to act. And it drives people crazy. It burns them out. And I remember very clearly telling a friend of mine early in my career practicing law, it's exhausting pretending to be someone else all day.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Because whether you're, it doesn't really matter what the leadership style is, what the dress is, etc. If you are trying to conform to any ideal version that's not yourself, that's impacting your leadership, that's impacting your productivity, that's impacting your health.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is a big part of why there's a lot of unhappy lawyers and a lot of unhappy women at the executive level saying, you know what, I don't really have to do this anymore. There's another way. I really believe there's another way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also just want to point out that this phenomenon, it affects men too.
Yes.
Like we're all expected to conform to gender stereotypes.
Yes.
It affects non-binary people. It affects people of all races because we all have these unconscious biases that we're just programmed to believe that people who look a certain way are supposed to act a certain way. And I think there are a lot of straight white men who are probably very unhappy too because they feel like they have to act in a certain way. And I think we would all be better off as whole humans if we could just be ourselves at work. And I think productivity would probably go up too because people would just be able to focus on getting the work done and less on thinking through like 40 times, okay, what is someone in my position expected to say or do in this situation, rather than what do I authentically want to say here?
There's a great book I want to recommend for your listeners called, and maybe you've read it, called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. And it's about stereotype and stereotype threats. I won't get into it now, but it's to what you were just talking about a couple of minutes ago. I think it's a great read and really insightful.
Okay. So young professionals too. I think this is an issue for young professionals too. And in fact, you mentioned in your article a report by the Project Management Institute showing that more than half of young professionals are likely to leave their jobs due to dissatisfaction with fulfillment and professional development and feeling like they're providing value. What's that all about?
Well, in some ways, and I'm gonna classify young professionals as Gen Z. I think the Gen Z generation has a lot of things right. I grew up as a Gen Xer where we worked ourselves, to the bone. We listened to everything our supervisors said, and we did it at the sacrifice of a lot of things in our lives. A lot of the folks in Gen Z are saying, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to set boundaries. My mental health is of utmost importance. We know that this generation and those younger are really suffering from greater mental health issues than ever before. And they also really prioritize this integration of work and life and are showing up very differently. So I think that's part of what you're seeing is that they're just like, we're not going to tolerate this. And then that creates some tension also then with the millennials and the Gen Xers who are supervising these folks, because sometimes maybe they're not showing up or they're, quote, ghosting their employer, or they're not working in a way that the employer feels is most productive or valuable. But I actually think that they are onto something. And I'm sure there's, of course, room for improvement with how they're showing up at work and so forth. But I think from like my perspective of this idea of revolutionizing the way we work, I think Gen Z is like, look, screw that. We're going to do this differently. And employer, you don't get to tell me how I live my life. I get to tell me how I'm going to live my life. So I think also, they are because that generational divide, they're lacking that integration of professional development and training and like, hey, how do you want to work? How can you work with us? Because what worked for you is not going to work with us. So can you help us? Let's be innovative to figure out how this is going to work out. Right. If you think about.
Right. Yeah, I know. I see that tension too, because again, I agree with you. I think they have a lot of valid points because they're talking about things that made me miserable in the early part of my career.
Exactly.
That pushed me to the point of burnout. But we're in an era where we've got multi-generational workforces.
Sometimes 5.
Yeah, sometimes 5, right? Because you've got the traditionals, you have the baby boomers, you have us, the Gen X, you've got the millennials, and then the Gen Zs. And it's a struggle to figure out how do we integrate those teams, because the expectations of a traditionalist and a baby boomer are so vastly different from a Gen Z person. We have to find a way to get them communicating and working together, because that's the reality. I mean, the demographics are such that that's going to continue for quite a while. And in fact, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is predicting that the share of workers over 65 in the workforce is actually going to grow over the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
So it's not an issue that's going away anytime soon, because people are living longer. They're being healthier longer. In a lot of cases, they have to work longer because they don't have sufficient retirement savings. So do you have any thoughts on how to get people sort of working together on those multi-generational teams?
I haven't given this a ton of thought, but as you were talking about it, a couple of things came up. One, you said communication, which made me think like it comes down to just sort of a very foundational, human to human interaction. I really believe in this, whether it's intergenerational or just peer to peer at work. But I think if the traditionalists can get to know the Gen Zers and vice versa from a human to human connection that's maybe facilitated by the workplace first, to see that we're all part of this greater experiment and dealing with the human condition, and we can learn from each other. I think about, Lori, like implementing potentially like the same paradigm that I'm seeing more and more about intergenerational housing. For example, I read an article, it's been a couple of years in the New York Times, where retirees were moving on university campuses, and there was shared housing between college students and, let's say, those in their 60s, because they have much to learn from each other. And I think the same thing can apply to the workplace. And, I haven't thought through like, how would that work? Like what things could be set up to create those connections. But I think that's what it comes down to, is really getting to know each other a little more on the human to human level, to really get an idea of that person's lived experience on both sides. And then from there, be able to figure out how to work together.
Yeah, that's the only bright idea I've come up with also, is just getting people talking, getting them communicating, letting them get to know each other. Because, I mean, I know for sure the baby boomers also were criticized by their elders for being lazy, flower children, hippies, right? I know that because I've seen, the motorcycle movie. What is that motorcycle movie called?
Yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I've seen Easy Rider. Yeah.
Easy Rider.
I know the baby boomers experienced the same kind of criticism about being lazy, entitled, and, because I've seen Easy Rider. So like, maybe it's just a matter of getting people to remember, oh yeah, like when I was in my early 20s, my early part of my career, my values were very different from what they are now that, I'm in the late stage of my career. And so as a way of kind of helping them connect with some of the younger folks, just doing a little bit of like old-fashioned remembering of what it was like for them as young professionals, I think probably could go a long way. But and I think that's really important, because you also pointed to some data from Deloitte showing that almost half of young lawyers in particular, but I'm guessing it's most young people generally in the workforce, feel exhausted, stressed, and anxious at work all or most of the time. What's driving that?
I think, it comes back to some of what we've already discussed. One is kind of how the system is set up. It's, again, set up in a very traditional way, and people are just working very differently now. I also think that post-pandemic, there's people overall, including younger people, are having a tougher time from a mental health perspective. I mean, there's so much data out there that's talking about how people's mental health has been impacted by the pandemic and post-pandemic. So I think those are a couple of contributing factors that, that are at play. And I think law firms are just, no different than any other large organization. We know all of the statistics around the struggles that lawyers have, and in particular young lawyers. And I just think the demands too in law, because of how the business model is set up. We've been talking about the billable hour model for probably longer than 2 decades, but I've been part of the conversation for 2 decades. That really drives, right? That drives more work, more exhaustion, more overwhelm, more productivity. And law firms are doing more, right? The American Bar Association issued the report that was the basis for the lawyer wellbeing report and task force nationally 2017, on which the Wisconsin task force was based. So there's lots of recognition of the problem and a lot of steps that have been taken to try and solve the problem. But to your point of the statistic you just cited, it's still very much present. And I think it's all of the same demands. And I think a big part of it, though, is the billable hour model. We are set up, law firms are set up, do more, charge more, earn more, bill more, make more. So I think until that's really upended, you're still going to have this cycle of exhaustion and overwhelm. Again, having said that, though, there's lots more discussion in law firms. There are coaches who law firms have hired to be on staff to help in a confidential way support their associates and their partners. There are well-being initiatives. So there's lots going on that did not exist even 10 years ago.
That's great to hear. So what are some of the well-being initiatives that you've seen that you think are particularly successful?
Great question. I think one of the ones is having coaches on staff. So a lot of big law, and even those who don't fall in the AmLaw 200, have one or more trained wellness coaches or career coaches who are employed by the law firm, but have it set up in a very confidential way. So there's kind of like a firewall around the conversations that the coach is having with the lawyer, including, I was just speaking to someone who works at one of the top 5 law firms. He's a career coach there, and they actually have a job board, a confidential job board set up for associates if they decide they want to go somewhere else, and the whole transaction is confidential. So that, I think, is working well, and it's becoming more common. I think the other thing that's working well is just like this more support for whatever you define wellness to be. The ABA has 6 or 8 components to what lawyer well-being means, spiritual, physical, mental, etc. And so there's lots of seminars, firms are offering on-site services like massages and yoga classes and meditation and things like that. Lots of CLE. Now in many states, CLE, there is like a wellness CLE unit or components.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's more recognition. So all of those things are working well. Also, a number of states, more than half of the states, have instituted a lawyer well-being task force where they make recommendations, much like Wisconsin did, for how to better support our attorneys. One set of attorneys who I haven't talked about because that wasn't my world, but I know really suffer, are the public defenders and the DAs, particularly in Wisconsin, and the solo practitioners. Those are 3, I think, underserved and underrepresented, or at least from my perspective, because my world has been big law. But these 3 groups are really under a lot of pressure. They have large caseloads. Oftentimes they're working alone and don't have the support. And I know Wisconsin actually has an annual solo and small law firm conference that's targeted just to those folks, which I think is great. So I think more can be done to also address those pockets that aren't being served by the big law firms, because all of those things that I just shared that are working well, that's been my experience with the larger law firms, with the exception, of course, of the state task force, which trickled down to all lawyers. But I think more can be done for those solo small practitioners and those lawyers who are in the public sector.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it's a whole different set of stressors that they face.
That's right. And they're not getting paid nearly as much, right, as those attorneys in big law, which can help ease some of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, the advantage of having a salary from a big law firm is you can afford therapy. And that not everyone has that luxury. You have health insurance, and not everyone has that luxury. So, yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of what we talked about is that it's really important for people to be able to find fulfillment and meaning in their work. So, I mean, how do you help people go about doing that?
Yeah, I think that's, for me, what it really comes down to. Not everybody is driven by a purpose first objective in their work. But for me, that's part of my value, because I find that when I am working from a purpose-driven perspective, I'm just happier and healthier and more fulfilled. So it kind of comes back to the same thing I was talking about with respect to clarity, is kind of starting fundamentally about identifying what's important to the individual, and also asking questions like, what happens if you don't make this change, to help them see the consequences if they decide not to make the change. What would that feel like? So I try to help them kind of get to that future state in the present moment, so they can feel both sides of that. What would it feel like if you did have the change and it did occur? What would that feel like in your body? So some of this visualization and really embodying what it would feel like both ways, and the benefits and the consequences of not doing that, can be a helpful first step in the process of our work together.
Excellent. Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation for me. And I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you think our audience should know.
I think it's just simply not being so hard on ourselves, because I see that criticism really holds people back, myself included. And so it's really as basic as that.
Yeah. And that's a hard thing for lawyers not to do, because we're the only profession that has a dedicated adversary whose job it is to criticize you and point out everything you've done wrong.
That's right. And our job is to be a risk manager, right? So we are constantly looking for the danger around us. So that's a really disempowering or negative mindset. We're looking at all the limitations as lawyers versus looking at all the possibilities in many ways.
Right. That's a really good point. It's a really good point. And if we could find a way to approach things with that more constructive mindset, it might really help with burnout and mental health issues.
I think just one final note, we talked about this earlier, is just, I really want people to know they're not alone. Like, there are other people who have gone through this, that they are not alone, that there is a path out. There is a path forward.
That's really encouraging. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing, because it helped me just to read your article in the Wisconsin lawyer and to have this conversation with you. And I'm hoping that other people listening will recognize they're not alone, no matter where they are in their career path, what career they're in. There is a way to find meaning and fulfillment and better work-life balance. So I really appreciate your time and the work that you do.
Thank you, Lori. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.